In recent years, more people have been lifted out of poverty around the world than ever before in human history. The World Bank estimates that the number of people in extreme poverty has fallen from some 37% of the world population 25 years ago to under 10% today. Expected mortality rates have dropped, illiteracy has dropped, the gap between average incomes in rich countries and average incomes in poor countries has dropped as countries like India and China have grown very much faster than developed countries. Within countries, inequality has dropped in some countries and increased in others. What about New Zealand? In recent years, there's been an enormous increase in focus on inequality. If you look at the dotted line there, that reflects the number of times inequality has been referred to in the New Zealand Herald over recent years. Between 2001 and 2009, inequality was mentioned just 38 times per year. 2 years later, that number had doubled, and last year, the Herald had 420 articles on inequality during the year, roughly 8 per week on average. And the odd thing is that huge increase in the focus on inequality actually coincided with a reduction in measured inequality. The Gini coefficient is an internationally recognized measure of inequality. If the Gini coefficient was 0, it would mean that all income was exactly equally distributed. If it were 1, it would mean that one person in the population had all the income. And that graph shows 2 lines, actually. One is the Gini coefficient for disposable income after tax and transfer payments. The other shows the Gini coefficient for spending over the same period. What you'll see is there's been a slight decrease in inequality since about the mid-90s, an increase in the late 80s and a decrease from about the mid-90s. My next graph looks at this issue from a somewhat longer period, and that graph shows not after-tax and transfer payment Gini coefficient, but pre-tax market income since the 30s. And you can see that in the 30s right through to about early 50s, the Gini coefficient was around 0.47, or getting on for 0.5. It fell over the next little period to around 0.4. I'm talking now pre-tax and transfer payments. And then it rose, which means that inequality became greater over the late 80s and has been roughly constant since that time. Well, how does New Zealand compare with other countries? That graph shows 2 things. Along the horizontal axis, the Gini coefficient compares New Zealand with a number of other countries. And as you can see, if you move it further to the right, countries are more unequal. Further to the left, they're less unequal. So we're clearly much more unequal than the Scandinavian countries and Germany in that graph, less unequal than the countries to our right, Japan, Australia, France, UK, US, and Canada. On the vertical axis, we measure generational earnings elasticity. In other words, how easy is it to move from a low income to a high income? And on that, we do worse than, again, the Scandinavian countries, about the same as Sweden, so worse than Finland and Denmark, about the same as Sweden, and appreciably better than Japan, Australia, France, UK, and the US. Now, I have to say that, unfortunately, the Gini coefficient in that graph is going back to the 80s, and the reason it is back there is because I couldn't get the vertical axis data more recently than that. But latest OECD data suggests that New Zealand is almost exactly on the average of developed countries in terms of income distribution. Just to exemplify that, I think in the latest OECD data, the Gini coefficient was 0.32. We are 0.33. Australia is 0.33, and so on. So very close to the average of OECD countries. Some cases we're worse, some cases we're better. Well, what accounts then for the very considerable economic stress on many families, as Jan was talking about it? And I believe the root cause of the large amount of social distress is caused by the price of housing. That table, I hope you can read it back there, shows some of the results of a survey conducted in the third quarter last year by an organization called Demographia. And they surveyed 406 cities across 9 countries: New Zealand, Australia, UK, US, Canada, Ireland, Singapore, Hong Kong. And it compares the median house price in each of those 406 cities with the median household income in those cities. Now, what you see is that Tauranga is the 8th least affordable city of the 406 cities surveyed in that survey. Auckland is worse, but Tauranga is the 8th least affordable city. And I believe that that is at the core of a large part of the social stress in this city, and indeed more generally in the country, because on average, the median multiple ratio between house prices and house income across New Zealand is about 6, classified in the survey as severely unaffordable, compared with a figure of about 3 in the early 90s. So from the early 90s, where the ratio was 3, to now around 6 for the nation as a whole, but to say in Tauranga, very close to 10. My final graph is showing, I need to explain that, the proportion of households which spend more than 30% of their income on housing. The bottom line, the dark blue line, is the highest income quintile. The highest income group of people in the country are spending, well, not many of them are spending more than 30% of their income on housing. Look at the lowest income quintile, which is the top line, and you find more than 40% of the households in that low-income group spend more than 30% of their total income on housing. And of course, as you will know, anecdotal evidence suggests that that 30% figure is well exceeded by many in low-income households. People spend over 40%, cases 50% of their total income on housing costs. And my belief is that that cost of housing is at the core of much of the problem of poverty in this city and indeed in this country. What does that mean? It means that the power to fix that is in the control of local authorities in this country. The Productivity Commission looked at the cost of housing back in 2010. They worked out 4 things which drive the cost of housing. 3 of them were a direct consequence of local government planning rules and processes. Thank you very much.